The government of Ontario has announced the new board of directors for Hydro One. Little is known about the selection process that got them to this point, but for some deeper analysis and what they've actually announced, let's bring in York University professor Richard Leblanc, a corporate governance expert. Richard, we mentioned in our newscast, a bunch of new board members. Tom Woods, who used to be at CIBC for many years, was the chief financial officer. He'll serve as the chair on an interim basis. First, your reaction to some of the names you saw listed in this new board for Hydro One.
I think it's a much better board. I count 9 of 10 directors as having senior operating or executive experience of large, complex institutions, which was not the case before. Most importantly, 20% of the board now has utility expertise, including the former CEO of New Brunswick Power and the former CEO of British Columbia Hydro. I see global expertise. I see significant financial expertise and operating expertise. So the board is a marked improvement over what it was.
Compare that to the previous board. Was there industry expertise? Were there people from the utility industry on that board of directors?
Not by my reading of it. The only director was about 8 years out from senior executive expertise. And when CEOs don't have operating expertise on the board, they often tell me, if I make a mistake, no one will know. So the fact that 2 of the 10 directors now are former CEOs of utilities, that's really comforting from a governance point of view.
So that answers my next question to a certain degree. How much industry operating experience does a board of directors really need to be a successful board of directors?
It needs at least a couple, which it didn't have before. So it's now got that, and it's got a bench of former CEOs, CFOs, chief risk officers, vice chairs, so that's also important.
So Tom Woods, who's going to be the interim chair, we already knew that he was going to be playing a role on this new board. Many years ago, people probably saw him come on BNN every quarter, talk about CIBC's financial results. He's got some board experience with Bank of America.
That's right, that's right.
So he's used to being on these very closely watched boards. But you've talked to us in the past about sitting on too many boards of directors. Is that going to be an issue with any of these board selections?
I'm seeing a bit of that here. I'm seeing sitting, including with Mr. Wood, sitting on 3 or more boards. There's evidence that you just don't have the time. I mean, the average directorship now is about 400 hours a year. For Hydro One, it's probably closer to 500. So each new director should count on dedicating this amount of time. For the chair, it's even more. So you don't want to see, a collection of current directorships. You want to see 2-3 boards at the very most.
I guess one of the controversies in the lead up to this announcement today was it seemed to some, or the headlines were suggesting, a little mystery around the nominating process. Do you have any further clarity today on that issue?
Well, it's still a critique. Is boards have been described as a black box, particularly director selection. We didn't know who was on the ad hoc nominating committee. We didn't know the process they used. We didn't know advertising or interviews or whether a search firm was used. And now we're pivoting to the board making its most important decision, which is the selection of the new CEO. So my advice to Hydro One would be transparency in the process. We didn't see a whole lot of transparency for director selection, but we certainly want to see it for CEO selection. So what we should see is who's on the CEO selection committee, what their qualifications are, what the process is, whether you're doing a global search, whether you're interviewing people, a long list, a short list, etc., what the criteria are. So Hydro One has to, and I think it will under this current board, have a much more transparent process.
And beyond the important decision of figuring out who the next CEO will be, obviously they're still in the middle of this high-profile U.S.-focused acquisition of Avista. And I guess the U.S. had paused passing any regulation on Hydro One's attempt to acquire the company, in part because of what's been going on?
That's right. They've pressed pause, but I don't see any pushback on following through with the merger. I think the incoming CEO, the incoming board has to honor existing contracts, but I think the issue has been executive pay for executives, director selection, and director qualifications, not the actual transactions within the company. So I would be surprised if the merger is discontinued by the incoming CEO.
Obviously, Doug Ford on the campaign trail said he was going to clean house at Hydro One.
Yes, right.
That's ultimately what we saw. If we were talking about a different scenario where you had an activist investor that acquired shares in a company and said, I don't like what's going on, I'm going to change the board of directors, we would actively watch to see what that activist investor felt like the new makeup. Since the Ontario government still ultimately is a major shareholder in Hydro One, do we have to continue to monitor the comments coming from Doug Ford and his team as to how they feel about this new board of directors, which clearly they play a role in?
I think we do, and I don't think Ford should drop the ball, or the energy minister. I think it's a great board. It's a market improvement, but we're not out of the woods yet. We still have to select the right CEO. So we should be looking to signals, but at some point, H1 will have to signal transparency and the CEO selection process, not the Ford government.
What are the biggest lessons learned here for other boards that might have similar structures to what Hydro One's looked like before this move?
Pick the right directors, rein in executive pay, and be accountable to shareholders, and in this case, ratepayers. This is a classic textbook example of governance gone wrong, and shareholder engagement with the board. Are
we going to have to watch actually what these board members are being paid? Because obviously that was one of the big, you talked about the $6 million man.
Yeah.
In Mayo Schmidt as the CEO, but then there was also some backlash for the compensation for the directors.
I sincerely doubt that they're going to make the same mistake twice. These are seasoned veteran directors. I think that they're not in it for the money. They're not going to pay themselves exorbitant fees, and they're certainly going to rein in executive pay for the CEO.
Okay, Richard, always good to get your take. Thanks
My pleasure,
very much.
Jeff.
Richard Leblanc, York University professor and corporate governance expert, with his take on the Hydro One story.